Would you believe me if I told you that a millionaire posed as a beggar, right in front of his own mansion? What he discovered changed his life forever. Imagine having everything you've ever dreamed of, money, power, a gigantic house, but feeling that something is missing. This is the story of James, a multi-millionaire businessman who decided to do something unimaginable. Disguise himself as a beggar to discover a truth that no one dared tell him. What he found was much more than he expected. James had a life that many would envy. Luxurious mansions, sports cars, trips to exotic destinations, and a bank account that seemed to have no limits. However, every time he looked around, he felt a growing unease. He asked himself, who really sees me as a person and not as a source of benefits? This doubt began to consume his thoughts. Friends, co-workers, and even family members seemed to treat James with calculated deference, as if every word and gesture was carefully planned to secure their approval or, worse, their financial favors. This feeling of emotional isolation only increased when he noticed the superficiality of the interactions around him. The laughter at parties, birthday messages, and even invitations to social events seemed to lack authenticity. He desperately wanted to believe that there were people who liked him for who he was, but the weight of doubt was unbearable. One particular episode reinforced his anguish. During a party he organized at his mansion, James decided to observe his guests' interactions. He noticed how the smiles diminished whenever he left a group and how the conversations seemed to change tone. What had been a celebration of his generosity had become, in his eyes, a spectacle of selfish interests. This realization left a deep mark. One day, while watching a documentary about people who chose to live simply in order to understand the true meaning of life, James had a radical idea. What if I could see the world as an ordinary person? With no money, no status, no privileges. This idea overwhelmed him. He knew that to get honest answers, he would have to put himself in a position to force others to reveal their true intentions. Executing this plan would be risky. James would need to temporarily disappear from his life of luxury without arousing suspicion. He began to plan meticulously. He bought used clothes from a thrift store, dirted his hands and face to look like he lived on the streets, and grew a beard to partially conceal his identity. But the place he chose for his experiment was the most daring of all, the gate of his own mansion. That morning, as he stood at the gate, James felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement. What am I doing? He thought, as the sun rose over the horizon. He knew that from that moment on, he was no longer the multi-millionaire James. He was just another invisible man in society, depending on the kindness or indifference of others to discover the truth he so desperately sought. In the early hours, James discovered what it meant to be invisible to most people. The traffic in front of his mansion was constant. Luxury cars came and went, delivery men arrived with packages, and neighbors hurried past to their appointments. However, no one stopped to look at him. He tried to catch the eye of a few, but all he got were looks of contempt or indifference. For someone who was used to being the center of attention, this was a shock. The first genuine contact came from a young food delivery man who, while leaving an order at the gate, noticed James and asked if he needed anything. "Are you all right?" asked the young man, with an expression of concern. James hesitantly asked for water. The young man promptly handed over his own bottle and said, "I hope things get better for you." This simple but sincere gesture was one of the first moments when James felt a glimmer of humanity. However, not all interactions were positive. One of the neighbors, passing through the gate, complained to the security guard about that beggar who was ruining the view. James heard every word and felt the humiliation of being treated as a nuisance. He began to realize how people's perceptions changed drastically depending on their appearance and social context. Over the days, James experienced the harsh reality of rejection. He tried to ask other passers-by for help, but was ignored or treated with contempt. The lowest point came when a group of teenagers passed by and laughed at him, mocking his appearance and even throwing coins on the ground, as if he were a caricature of a beggar. James felt a mixture of anger and sadness. He knew it was part of the experiment, but the pain of humiliation was real. Despite this, sporadic moments of kindness continued to appear. An elderly woman who passed by every day left him a sandwich wrapped in paper. A gardener who worked nearby asked if he needed work and offered a few coins, even though he had little for himself. These gestures, although small, contrasted with the behavior of the majority and began to shape James' perspective on what human connection really meant. Looking at the mansion from the outside, he also began to reflect on his own life. He remembered how many times, within his bubble of wealth, he himself had ignored people in situations of need. This experience was forcing him to confront not only the superficiality of others, but also his own. James began to mentally note down every interaction, positive or negative, trying to understand what it meant for his search for authenticity. He realized that the most genuine people were often those who had the least to offer materially, but who gave from the heart. At the same time, those he expected to be kind, his high-end neighbors, often showed the opposite. This phase of the experiment began to transform James in ways he didn't yet fully understand, but he knew he was getting closer to answers that could change his worldview forever. As the days went by, James began to realize something that until then had seemed intangible: the true face of the humanity that surrounded him. He had become invisible to those who used to fawn over him, but deeply visible to strangers who had nothing to gain from him. However, the most revealing moment came from where he least expected it, from inside his own mansion. It all started when one of the house's employees, responsible for gate security, was instructed to deal with the beggar who, according to some neighbors, was bringing visual discomfort to the street. The irony of being treated as a nuisance in front of his own property did not go unnoticed by James. The security guard, a man called Carlos, approached him with a stern expression. "You can't stay here. You're scaring people," he said in an almost automatic tone, as if it were a script already memorized. But something changed when James looked directly into his eyes and said, "I just need some water and a minute to rest." Carlos hesitated. For a moment, the mask of professionalism fell away, and he looked at him in a more human way. Instead of kicking him out, he offered him a bottle of water and said, "I can't let you stay here for long, but I know what it's like to need help. Just make it quick." James thanked him and watched, intrigued, as a simple act of compassion broke down the barrier he had felt from so many other people. Carlos didn't know he was helping his own boss, but this small gesture carried an immense emotional weight. On the same day, something even more impactful happened. James noticed a familiar woman getting out of one of the cars that had pulled up in front of the mansion. It was his personal assistant, Sarah, one of the few people he still trusted. Curious to see how she would react, he approached her while she was absent-mindedly organizing documents in the back seat of the vehicle. "Please, ma'am, would you have something to eat?" he asked, his voice disguised by a rehearsed hoarseness. Sarah turned around quickly, her expression of surprise turning to discomfort. "Sorry, I don't have anything right now. But I hope you can get help elsewhere." Her words were polite but cold, and she quickly closed the car door and headed into the mansion. This interaction hit James like a punch in the gut. Sarah, who often talked about empathy and social justice, seemed incapable of extending these values to someone she saw as inferior. He realized that even those he believed to be trustworthy could act differently when faced with unexpected situations. But the most transformative moment was yet to come. In the late afternoon, while James was sitting on the sidewalk, a group of children passing by stopped to watch him. Unlike the teenagers who had laughed at him a few days earlier, these children seemed curious and, in a way, genuinely concerned. One of the girls approached him and offered him a packet of cookies she was holding. "My mother says we should always help those in need," she said with a shy smile. James felt a lump in his throat as he accepted the package. It was such a simple gesture, but it carried a purity that he rarely saw in the adult world. At that moment, James began to understand that his experience went beyond finding out who was genuine or not. He was witnessing how different levels of power, privilege, and perspective shaped people's actions. Most importantly, he began to see himself in an invisible mirror, reflecting not only others, but his own flaws and disconnects. In the evening, something extraordinary happened. A group of homeless people who lived nearby began to gather on the sidewalk next to him. Curious about the new face in their community, they welcomed him as if he were one of their own. They shared food, stories, and laughter, even though they had so little to offer. For James, this was the most powerful revelation of all. In the midst of those who had nothing, he found the greatest wealth of all: solidarity and genuine love. There, surrounded by people who treated him as an equal, he realized that the answer he was looking for was never in his money or his position. It lay in human connection devoid of interest. James felt he was on the verge of a radical change in his life. The experience as a beggar not only exposed the flaws of the people around him, but also revealed his own limitations as a human being. And for the first time in years, he began to see a way to fill the void that was consuming him. Now he knew what he needed to do to transform not only his life, but also the lives of everyone who crossed his path. James began to see human interactions in a new light. Every gesture of kindness or contempt was not just a reflection on who others were, but a mirror that forced him to look at himself. He realized that his wealth had built barriers, not only between him and others, but also within himself. The quiet arrogance he had nurtured over the years was being challenged. He saw in himself traits of those who ignored him now: indifference, quick judgment, and the assumption of superiority. As the experiment progressed, James began to plan how he would use this experience to transform his life. He knew that the next step would be crucial. He was ready to return to his mansion, not as the man who had left, but as someone deeply impacted by the lessons he had learned. He felt that the real test was yet to come: how to apply everything he had discovered to change not only his own perspective, but also the world around him. This decision would lead him to where he would finally face his old life with his eyes open to the truths he had refused to see for so long. Just for those who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching. And there's one more thing: Trump approaches an elderly homeless woman. What he does next shocks everyone. That's the theme of the video I've pinned here. Just click and watch. I'll see you there.